In the early 1800s, the map of North America looked very different from the one we recognize today. The United States was growing, restless, and ambitious. Mexico was vast, newly independent and deeply unstable, and between them stretched a massive frontier filled with uncertainty, opportunity, and eventually, war. The conflict that would later become known as the Mexican-American War did not begin overnight. It grew slowly, fueled by ambition, fear, political chaos, and the belief, held by many Americans, that their nation was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. But to understand how this war began, we have to start in Mexico. In 1821, after more than a decade of revolution and armed struggle, Mexico finally won its independence from Spain. The victory ended 3 centuries of colonial rule, but independence did not bring stability. In fact, it brought something very different: chaos. The young nation inherited an enormous territory, roughly 4.5 million square kilometers. It stretched from modern-day Oregon in the north all the way down through Central America. On paper, it was one of the largest countries in the world, but size did not equal strength. 11 years of war had devastated the economy. Infrastructure was weak. Government institutions barely existed. And the revolutionaries who had fought so hard for independence had never fully agreed on what kind of nation Mexico should become. Some wanted a monarchy. Others demanded a republic. Some supported strong, centralized authority. Others believed power should belong to individual states. The result was constant political upheaval. Presidents rose and fell with alarming speed. Military officers seized power through coups. Regional leaders challenged the authority of the central government. And the treasury, the lifeblood of any functioning nation, was nearly empty. Mexico also faced threats from outside its borders. Spain had not completely abandoned its hopes of reclaiming its former colony. Spanish forces in nearby Cuba still posed a potential danger. At the same time, the young republic struggled to control its distant northern territories. Those lands, Texas, California, and New Mexico, were enormous, sparsely populated, and far from the center of power in Mexico City. And that distance would soon matter a great deal, because while Mexico struggled to stabilize itself, the United States was experiencing something very different: growth. Rapid, relentless growth. In 1803, the United States had doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase, acquiring a vast territory from France that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. American settlers moved westward in huge numbers. Native American lands were seized. New territories became new states, and a powerful idea began to take hold in American politics: the idea that expansion was not just possible, but inevitable. By the 1830s, the United States had begun looking beyond its existing borders. And just across the frontier, Mexico's northern territories, thinly defended, politically unstable, and rich in land, appeared increasingly tempting. What happened next would reshape the map of North America forever, and it would begin in a place called Texas. In the early 1820s, Texas was a distant frontier of Mexico. The region was enormous, wild, and thinly populated. Only a few thousand Mexican citizens lived there, scattered across vast plains and river valleys. The Mexican government faced a serious problem. It simply did not have enough people to control the territory. So Mexico made a decision that, at the time, seemed practical. They invited settlers from the United States to move into Texas. Under a system known as impresario grants, American families were offered land, cheap land, sometimes almost free. In return, they were expected to follow Mexican law, convert to Catholicism, and swear loyalty to the Mexican government. At first, the plan worked. Thousands of American settlers poured into Texas during the 1820s. Farms appeared across the countryside. Small towns began to grow. Trade expanded. For a brief moment, it looked like Mexico had successfully strengthened its northern frontier. But beneath the surface, tension was already building. Many of the new settlers still considered themselves culturally American. They spoke English, practiced Protestant Christianity, and maintained strong economic ties to the United States. One issue in particular would ignite conflict: slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, but many American settlers in Texas had brought enslaved people with them to work cotton plantations. The clash between Mexican law and the economic interests of the settlers created deep resentment. At the same time, the Mexican government grew uneasy about the rapid influx of Americans. By 1830, the number of American settlers in Texas far outnumbered Mexican citizens living there. Mexico feared it was losing control of its own territory, so the government attempted to slow immigration from the United States and strengthen military authority in the region. For many Texans, this felt like oppression. Political tensions rose. Local leaders began speaking openly about resistance, and by 1835, the situation exploded into open rebellion. The Texas Revolution had begun. One of the most famous moments of that revolution came at a small mission compound in San Antonio known as the Alamo. In 1836, Mexican General Antonio López de Santa Anna led thousands of soldiers into Texas to crush the rebellion. A small group of Texan defenders barricaded themselves inside the Alamo and refused to surrender. For 13 days they held out. Then the Mexican army stormed the fortress. Every defender was killed. The battle became legendary. "Remember the Alamo" soon became a rallying cry for Texan forces. Just weeks later, at the Battle of San Jacinto, Texan General Sam Houston launched a surprise attack against Santa Anna's army. In less than 20 minutes, the Mexican army collapsed. Santa Anna himself was captured. Under pressure, he signed agreements recognizing Texas as an independent republic, but Mexico refused to fully accept the loss. To the Mexican government, Texas was still rebellious territory, not a legitimate nation, and certainly not part of the United States. For nearly a decade, the Republic of Texas existed as an independent country, but its leaders had always wanted something more. They wanted to join the United States, and that decision would push two nations closer and closer to war. During the 1830s and early 1840s, the young Republic of Texas stood in a fragile position. Technically, it was an independent nation. It had its own government, its own army, and its own president. But independence came with serious problems. Texas was heavily in debt. Its population was small, and Mexico still refused to recognize its sovereignty. To Mexican leaders, Texas remained a rebellious province that would one day be reclaimed. But the leaders of Texas had a different vision. From the very beginning, many Texans believed their future lay with the United States. Culturally, economically, and politically, they were already deeply connected to their neighbor to the east. Trade flowed across the border. American settlers continued arriving, and many Texans openly supported annexation by the United States. Yet the situation was complicated. In Washington, the idea of bringing Texas into the Union sparked fierce debate. One issue overshadowed all others: slavery. Texas allowed slavery. If admitted into the United States, it would likely become a slave state. That possibility alarmed many politicians in the northern states who feared the growing political power of slaveholding regions. At the same time, another concern loomed large: war with Mexico. The Mexican government had repeatedly warned that annexing Texas would be considered an act of aggression. If the United States absorbed Texas into the Union, Mexico might respond with military force. For years, American leaders hesitated. Texas remained independent throughout the late 1830s and early 1840s, waiting, watching, and lobbying Washington for admission. Then, in 1844, American politics changed. A new presidential candidate emerged with a bold message about the future of the United States. His name was James K. Polk. Polk ran on a platform of expansion. He believed the United States was destined to grow across the continent. His supporters spoke openly about a powerful idea that was spreading across American politics: manifest destiny, the belief that Americans had a divine mission to expand westward and bring their political system, their culture, and their economy across North America. For Polk, this vision included Texas, but it did not stop there. He also had his eyes on California, New Mexico, and the vast lands that now make up the American Southwest. In Polk's mind, these territories were not simply opportunities, they were the future. After Polk won the election in 1844, events began moving quickly. The United States approved the annexation of Texas. On December 29, 1845, Texas officially became the 28th state of the United States. For Americans who supported expansion, it was a moment of celebration. For Mexico, it was a provocation. The Mexican government still considered Texas its territory. The annexation was seen not as a diplomatic decision, but as the theft of land. And there was another problem. Neither country agreed on where Texas actually ended. The Republic of Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border. Mexico insisted the boundary lay farther north at the Nueces River. Between those two rivers stretched a wide strip of disputed land. It was empty, tense, and dangerous. And in 1846, that disputed territory would become the spark that ignited a war. By early 1846, the tension between the United States and Mexico had reached a breaking point. President James K. Polk was determined to secure the new southern border of Texas at the Rio Grande. To enforce that claim, he ordered American troops under General Zachary Taylor to move south toward the disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. To Mexico, this was a direct provocation. From the Mexican perspective, the United States had not only annexed Texas, land Mexico still believed belonged to it, but was now sending soldiers deeper into territory Mexico considered its own. The situation was volatile. Both nations were watching each other carefully, each waiting for the other to make the first move. American soldiers built a fort along the Rio Grande. Mexican forces gathered nearby. Patrols from both sides moved through the disputed land. It was a powder keg. Then, on April 25, 1846, the spark came. A group of Mexican cavalry encountered a small American reconnaissance unit led by Captain Seth Thornton. The clash was brief but deadly. Several American soldiers were killed and others were captured. When news of the incident reached Washington, President Polk moved quickly. He addressed Congress with a powerful statement. Mexico, he declared, had shed American blood upon American soil. To Polk and his supporters, the incident proved that Mexico had initiated hostilities. Critics would later argue that American troops had deliberately been placed in disputed territory to provoke exactly this kind of confrontation. Even some soldiers who served in the war later questioned its origins. Years afterward, Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in the conflict as a young Army lieutenant, would write in his memoirs that the movement of American troops toward the Rio Grande had been designed to provoke Mexico into attacking first. But in the spring of 1846, the political momentum was already moving toward war. On May 13, 1846, the United States Congress officially declared war on Mexico. Mexico, although it never issued a formal declaration of war in the same way, quickly mobilized its army and prepared to defend its territory. The conflict had begun, and in the early days of the war, the fighting centered along the Texas frontier. General Zachary Taylor's army soon faced Mexican forces in two important battles. The first took place on May 8, 1846, near a place called Palo Alto. The American army, equipped with powerful mobile artillery known as flying artillery, held a crucial advantage. These fast-moving cannons could be repositioned quickly across the battlefield, delivering devastating firepower. Mexican troops fought bravely but struggled against the American artillery barrage. The following day, the armies clashed again at the Battle of Resaca de la Palma. This time, the fighting became chaotic and intense. Dense brush and ravines broke up the battlefield, turning the encounter into a close and brutal fight. Once again, American forces emerged victorious. The victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma pushed Mexican troops south of the Rio Grande and gave the United States early momentum in the war. But these initial battles were only the beginning, because the war would soon expand far beyond the Texas frontier. It would spread across deserts, mountains, and coastlines, from New Mexico to California, and eventually all the way to the gates of Mexico City itself. As the war widened in 1846, the United States did not plan to fight on just one front. American leaders understood that Mexico's northern territories were vast, thinly defended, and far from the country's political center. If those regions could be seized quickly, it would cripple Mexico's ability to defend the rest of its territory. So while General Zachary Taylor pushed south from Texas, other American forces began moving west. One of those forces was led by General Stephen Watts Kearny. Kearny commanded what became known as the Army of the West, a force of roughly 17,000 soldiers. His mission was bold: march hundreds of miles across the frontier, capture New Mexico, and then continue toward California. It was an ambitious plan. In the summer of 1846, Kearny's army began its long journey westward along the Santa Fe Trail. The march was difficult. The distances were enormous, the terrain harsh, and supplies limited. But when the American army finally approached the city of Santa Fe in August of 1846, something unexpected happened. There was no battle. Mexican forces in the region offered little resistance. Facing a larger American army and lacking reinforcements from central Mexico, local officials chose to withdraw rather than fight. On August 15, 1846, American troops entered Santa Fe. Without firing a single shot, the United States had captured the entire New Mexico territory. Kearny quickly declared himself military governor and established a temporary civil government. A new legal system, later known as the Kearny Code, was introduced to administer the region. With New Mexico secured, Kearny turned his attention toward the next objective: California. Meanwhile, along the Pacific coast, American naval forces were already moving. The United States Navy had received orders to blockade California's ports and seize key coastal cities if war broke out. In July of 1846, American naval commanders raised the U.S. flag over Monterey, the capital of Mexican California. The takeover happened quickly. Local Mexican authorities lacked the manpower and resources to resist effectively. In many cases, government officials simply withdrew inland. Soon afterward, American forces entered Los Angeles. By August 1846, U.S. commanders were reporting that California was effectively under American control. But the situation on the ground was far more complicated than it first appeared. Many Californios, Mexican residents of California, resented the sudden occupation of their land. Rebellions soon broke out against the American presence, particularly in Southern California. Fighting erupted again as Mexican and Californio forces attempted to push American troops out of the region. General Kearny, marching across the desert toward California, soon found himself caught in this renewed conflict. In December of 1846, Kearny's forces encountered Mexican cavalry near the village of San Pascual. The clash turned into one of the bloodiest battles fought in California during the war. Outnumbered and exhausted after their long march, Kearny's troops suffered heavy losses before reinforcements finally arrived. Despite the setback, American forces eventually regrouped and continued their advance. By early 1847, organized resistance in California had largely collapsed. But while the Americans secured the West, the most decisive battles of the war were still ahead. Because the war's ultimate objective was no longer just disputed borderlands. It was the heart of Mexico itself. While American forces were securing California and New Mexico in the west, the most intense fighting of the war was unfolding farther east. General Zachary Taylor had continued pushing deeper into northern Mexico. After his early victories along the Rio Grande, Taylor advanced toward the city of Monterrey, one of the most important strongholds in northern Mexico. By September of 1846, his army, about 6,000 soldiers, approached the heavily defended city. Waiting for them was a determined Mexican force under General Pedro de Ampudia. Unlike the open battlefields of Palo Alto, Monterrey presented a new and dangerous challenge: urban warfare. American soldiers had little experience fighting inside cities. Monterrey's narrow streets, thick stone buildings, and fortified positions gave Mexican defenders a powerful advantage. When the battle began, American troops advanced directly into the city and quickly discovered just how deadly the environment could be. Mexican soldiers fired from rooftops, windows, and hidden positions along the streets. Every intersection became a potential ambush. American units marching through the open streets were suddenly exposed to gunfire from multiple directions. The fighting turned brutal. House by house, street by street, American troops slowly adapted. Instead of moving down exposed streets, they began breaking through the walls of buildings, advancing from house to house to avoid enemy fire. For several days, intense combat raged across the city. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. Eventually, with American troops gaining ground and supplies running low, General Ampudia agreed to negotiate. The result was an armistice that allowed Mexican forces to evacuate Monterrey in exchange for surrendering the city. For Taylor, the victory was significant, but the agreement caused frustration in Washington. President Polk worried that Taylor's growing popularity and his willingness to negotiate with Mexican commanders might complicate the broader war strategy, so the administration made a bold decision. Instead of reinforcing Taylor for a deeper advance into Mexico, Polk shifted attention to a completely different plan: a direct strike at the heart of Mexico. That mission would be given to one of the most experienced officers in the United States Army, General Winfield Scott. Scott proposed a daring strategy: an amphibious invasion along Mexico's Gulf Coast, followed by a march inland toward Mexico City. If successful, it could end the war quickly by capturing the Mexican capital. But before Scott could begin his campaign, another major battle would unfold in northern Mexico. In early 1847, Mexican leader Antonio López de Santa Anna gathered a massive army and marched north to confront Taylor's forces. Santa Anna had nearly 20,000 men. Taylor had fewer than 5,000. The two armies met near a narrow mountain pass called Buena Vista in February of 1847. Outnumbered nearly 4-1, the American army prepared for what many believed would be a crushing defeat. Santa Anna demanded surrender. Taylor refused. The following morning, the battle began. At dawn on February 23, 1847, the battle for Buena Vista erupted across the cold, dusty hills of northern Mexico. General Antonio López de Santa Anna believed victory was within his grasp. His army, though exhausted from a long march north, still outnumbered the Americans by thousands. Facing him across the rugged terrain stood General Zachary Taylor and a much smaller force of American soldiers, barely 46 men. Many of them were volunteers with limited combat experience. The battlefield itself was harsh and uneven. Steep ridges, dry ravines, and narrow passes cut through the landscape, creating natural defensive positions. Taylor used the terrain carefully, placing artillery and infantry along the slopes and choke points of the mountain pass. Santa Anna attacked with confidence. Mexican infantry advanced in large formations, while cavalry units maneuvered across the flanks. At several points during the battle, the Mexican assault nearly shattered the American lines. The fighting became chaotic. Clouds of dust rose from the battlefield as thousands of soldiers moved, fired, and clashed across the rocky ground. Cannon fire echoed through the mountains. At one moment, a powerful Mexican assault pushed deep into the American position, forcing some units to retreat. It looked for a moment like the American army might collapse, but the American artillery proved decisive. Mobile horse artillery units rushed from one threatened position to another, firing devastating volleys of grapeshot into advancing Mexican formations. These rapid strikes repeatedly halted Mexican breakthroughs at critical moments. Hour after hour, the battle raged. Santa Anna continued pressing his numerical advantage, launching wave after wave of attacks against the American line. But his troops were tired, hungry, and struggling to coordinate across the difficult terrain. By evening, both sides had suffered heavy losses. And then, unexpectedly, Santa Anna made a decision that would change the course of the battle. Instead of launching another assault the following day, he ordered his army to withdraw. Reports had reached him that political instability and possible rebellion were once again threatening the government in Mexico City. Santa Anna feared that remaining in the north too long might weaken his hold on power at home, so he turned his army south. For Taylor and his soldiers, it felt like a miraculous escape. The Battle of Buena Vista became a powerful symbol in the United States. Newspapers celebrated the victory, and General Zachary Taylor's reputation soared across the country. But while Taylor held the North, the most decisive campaign of the war was just beginning. Far to the south, along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, General Winfield Scott was preparing an operation that had never before been attempted by the United States Army. A massive amphibious invasion. His target was the fortified port city of Veracruz, Mexico's most important gateway from the sea. If Scott could capture Veracruz and march inland, the road to Mexico City would lie open, and that meant the war was about to enter its most dramatic chapter. In the spring of 1847, General Winfield Scott launched one of the most daring military operations in American history. His objective was clear: capture the port of Veracruz and open the road to Mexico City. To do that, Scott assembled an army of nearly 9,000 soldiers and transported them by sea to the Gulf Coast of Mexico. It was an ambitious plan, requiring precise coordination between the Army and the Navy. On March 9, 1847, the operation began. American ships gathered off the coast near Veracruz as hundreds of soldiers prepared to land. One by one, they climbed into small boats and began rowing toward the beach. It was the largest amphibious landing the United States had ever attempted, and remarkably, it went almost perfectly. Wave after wave of soldiers reached the shore with minimal resistance. Within hours, Scott's army had surrounded the city of Veracruz, cutting it off from reinforcements and supplies. The siege had begun. Veracruz was heavily fortified, protected by thick walls and powerful coastal defenses. Mexican artillery returned fire as American forces began bombarding the city with heavy cannons and mortars. For days, the bombardment continued. Shells rained down on the city, shaking buildings and shattering defenses. Civilians and soldiers alike took shelter as explosions echoed through the streets. The pressure quickly became unbearable. Facing overwhelming firepower and fearing the destruction of the city, Mexican commanders surrendered on March 29, 1847. Veracruz had fallen. The victory was a major turning point. With the port secured, Scott now had a stable supply line from the sea. Reinforcements, weapons, and food could flow directly into his army. Now the path to the interior lay open, but the road from Veracruz to Mexico City was not easy. It climbed through rugged mountains and narrow passes, where defending armies could easily block the advance. And Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was already preparing for exactly that. Roughly 50 miles inland, Santa Anna positioned his army along the main road at a mountain pass called Cerro Gordo. His force of around 12,000 soldiers dug in along the high ground, placing artillery to dominate the road where he expected the Americans to attack. It was a strong defensive position, but Scott had experienced officers, and they were already looking for a way around it. Instead of charging directly into Santa Anna's guns, American scouts explored the surrounding hills and discovered a narrow trail that could lead troops behind the Mexican lines. It was risky, but if it worked, the Americans could outflank the entire defensive position. On April 18, 1847, the Battle of Cerro Gordo began. American forces launched a coordinated assault. While one part of the army attacked from the front, another force moved along the hidden trail and struck the Mexican position from the rear. The result was devastating. Caught between two attacks, Mexican defenses collapsed. Santa Anna's army broke apart, leaving behind artillery, supplies, and thousands of prisoners. The road to Mexico City was now open, and Winfield Scott's army began marching west. After the victory at Cerro Gordo, General Winfield Scott's army continued its steady march toward the Mexican capital. The road to Mexico City stretched through valleys, villages, and mountain passes, each mile bringing the American army deeper into the heart of Mexico. But the further Scott advanced, the more dangerous the campaign became. Mexican resistance did not disappear after Cerro Gordo. Instead, it changed. Rather than confronting the American army in large open battles, smaller groups of fighters began attacking supply lines and isolated units. Guerrilla warfare spread across the countryside. American wagons carrying food, ammunition, and equipment became frequent targets. Snipers hid along narrow roads. Ambushes struck suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. For Scott's army, maintaining supply lines hundreds of miles from the coast became one of the greatest challenges of the campaign. Yet the advance continued. By the summer of 1847, American forces had moved dangerously close to Mexico City. The capital itself was protected by a series of defensive positions, fortifications, causeways, and natural barriers that guarded the approaches to the city. Mexican forces prepared for a desperate defense. One of the first major clashes occurred in August of 1847, near the village of Contreras. Mexican troops had fortified strong defensive positions on rugged volcanic terrain just outside the city. The landscape was rough, broken by sharp lava fields and narrow paths. Many believed it would be extremely difficult for the Americans to attack. But once again, Scott's officers searched for weaknesses in the enemy position. During the night, American troops maneuvered through the rough terrain, quietly positioning themselves behind the Mexican defenses. When the attack began at dawn, the result was swift and overwhelming. The Mexican army at Contreras collapsed in less than an hour. The American victory opened the path to another defensive line just a few miles away, Churubusco. Here, Mexican forces fought fiercely to slow the American advance. The battle turned into a brutal struggle around fortified positions and a heavily defended convent that had been converted into a stronghold. For hours, Mexican soldiers resisted the American assault. Some of the defenders were members of the St. Patrick's Battalion, Irish immigrants who had originally served in the U.S. Army but defected and joined the Mexican side. They fought with determination, manning artillery and defending the walls of the convent until ammunition finally ran out. By the end of the battle, Churubusco had fallen. American troops were now only a few miles from Mexico City. The capital was within reach. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the war might end through negotiation rather than destruction. Peace talks began between representatives of both nations. But the negotiations quickly collapsed. Neither side was willing to accept the terms proposed by the other, and so the war continued. The final battles for Mexico City were about to begin. By September of 1847, the American army stood just outside Mexico City. The capital of Mexico was one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere, filled with churches, government buildings, narrow streets, and nearly 200,000 residents. Protecting the city were several layers of defenses, fortified positions, stone gates, and natural barriers designed to slow any invading force. Among those defenses stood one of the most important strongholds of all, Chapultepec. Perched on a hill overlooking the western approach to the city, Chapultepec Castle served as a military academy and fortress. Its elevated position allowed defenders to observe and control the surrounding roads leading into Mexico City. For the American Army, capturing Chapultepec was essential. Without it, the road into the city remained blocked. Mexican troops prepared to defend the position with everything they had left. Many of the defenders were young military cadets, students of the Mexican Military Academy, who refused to abandon the fortress even as the American army approached. On September 12, American artillery opened fire. Cannons bombarded the hilltop fortress throughout the day, smashing sections of its walls and sending clouds of smoke rising above the city skyline. The following morning, the assault began. American infantry advanced toward the hill, climbing the steep slopes under heavy gunfire. Mexican defenders fought fiercely, firing from the castle walls and defensive positions along the hillside. The battle was intense and chaotic. Soldiers struggled upward through smoke, rubble, and enemy fire. At several points, the attack nearly stalled as Mexican defenders poured bullets and artillery down the hill. But slowly, the Americans pushed forward. Ladders were raised against the castle walls. Troops climbed upward under constant fire. Finally, after hours of fighting, American soldiers broke through the defenses and surged into the fortress. Chapultepec had fallen. The fall of the castle opened the western gates of Mexico City. Soon after, American forces advanced toward the city itself, targeting two key entry points, the Belen Gate and the San Cosme Gate. Mexican soldiers fought desperately in the streets and along the defensive walls, trying to hold back the advancing army. But the situation was becoming hopeless. Mexican forces had suffered heavy losses throughout the campaign. Supplies were running low, and many soldiers were exhausted after months of war. By September 14, 1847, American troops entered Mexico City. The capital of Mexico was now under foreign occupation. General Winfield Scott established military control over the city, becoming the military governor of the occupied capital. For the United States, the capture of Mexico City marked the decisive moment of the war. Mexico's government was shattered. Its armies were scattered, and the country faced the painful reality that the conflict could no longer be won on the battlefield. Now, the question became how the war would end. With Mexico City under American occupation, the war had effectively reached its conclusion. But victory created a new and complicated problem for the United States. What should be done next? Some American politicians believed the opportunity was far greater than simply ending the war. They argued that since the U.S. Army now occupied the Mexican capital, the United States should annex not just northern territories, but perhaps even Mexico itself. It was a bold idea, but it quickly ran into serious opposition. Many Americans believed absorbing the entire nation of Mexico would create enormous political and cultural challenges. Mexico had a large population, a different language, a different religion, and a deeply different political tradition. Even supporters of expansion began to hesitate. In the end, most American leaders agreed on a more limited objective. They wanted the northern territories, Texas, California, and New Mexico. Meanwhile, inside Mexico, the situation was desperate. The war had drained the country's resources. Cities had been occupied, armies defeated, and political instability had only grown worse. Desertion had plagued the Mexican army throughout the war. Many soldiers had been poorly supplied, poorly trained, and barely paid. Most were rural peasants who felt stronger loyalty to their villages and families than to distant generals or politicians. As the war dragged on, thousands simply walked away from the battlefield. Facing the reality of defeat, Mexican leaders finally agreed to negotiate. The result was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848. The treaty officially ended the Mexican-American War. Under its terms, Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. But that was only the beginning. Mexico also ceded enormous territories to the United States, lands known at the time as Alta California and New Mexico. These regions would later become the modern American states of California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, along with parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In exchange for this massive transfer of land, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million. Even at the time, many observers noted how small that payment seemed compared to the vast territory involved. But the war had left Mexico with little bargaining power. The United States had gained more than 900,000 square miles of land. It was one of the largest territorial expansions in American history, and it transformed the future of North America forever. The Mexican-American War ended in 1848, but its consequences would echo across the continent for generations. Almost overnight, the map of North America had been dramatically redrawn. The United States now stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The dream of a coast-to-coast nation, something many Americans had imagined for decades, had suddenly become reality. But this enormous expansion raised new and dangerous questions inside the United States itself, because every new territory brought a political dilemma. Would these new lands allow slavery or prohibit it? That debate soon ignited fierce arguments between northern and southern states. Politicians clashed in Congress over how the territories should be organized, and tensions between slave states and free states began rising rapidly. In many ways, the territorial gains from the Mexican-American War helped accelerate the political crisis that would eventually explode into the American Civil War just over a decade later. For Mexico, the consequences were even more devastating. The country had lost roughly half of its national territory. What had once been a vast northern frontier was now permanently part of the United States. The loss reshaped Mexico's economy, its national identity, and its relationship with its powerful northern neighbor. The war also left deep emotional scars. Many Mexicans viewed the conflict as an act of aggression by a rapidly expanding United States. To them, the war symbolized a moment when a stronger nation took advantage of Mexico's political instability and internal struggles. And even within the United States, the war remained controversial. Some American leaders had strongly opposed it from the beginning. One of them was a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. During the war, Lincoln openly questioned President Polk's justification for the conflict, demanding evidence of the exact location where American blood had supposedly been shed on American soil. Others, like future Civil War General Ulysses S. Grant, later reflected on the war with deep unease. Grant would eventually write that he believed the conflict had been unjust, a war of expansion carried out against a weaker nation. Yet regardless of how it was viewed politically or morally, the war permanently altered the balance of power in North America. The United States emerged larger, wealthier, and more confident in its continental ambitions. And just a few years later, another discovery in one of the newly acquired territories would change the nation yet again: gold. In 1848, gold was discovered in California. Within months, hundreds of thousands of people began racing westward in one of the largest migrations in American history. The land gained through the Mexican-American War had suddenly become the center of a global rush for fortune. A war that began with a disputed border along the Rio Grande had reshaped an entire continent, and its legacy still shapes the United States, Mexico, and the border between them to this day.